Good morning and welcome to the 6th edition of GCSE English Revision Pod. I say good morning because we're actually recording this at about 7 o'clock in the morning in Mr. Forster's car.
To set the scene for you, it's cold and dark outside.
I'm feeling a little bit nervous, which I think is another theme that comes across in the text we're going to look at today. But I think before we talk about today's text, we should say that we've updated the bios in the other podcasts we've done so far. They now all include a handout which has both the question on it and also key quotations and vocabulary we've used in the podcast. So
and don't forget key context as well.
They include everything, sir.
Everything you could need.
It's a one-stop shop for everything you could possibly need. So please go back to those previous podcasts and download those handouts because we think they will be really helpful as an accompaniment to what we've done so far.
And just as a quick note on that, one way I'd suggest that it'd be really useful to listen to this podcast is actually to print out that handout before you listen. Then you can sit there making notes while you listen to the podcast. I think that's active revision. I always tell my students is one of the best ways to really remember things that are going on.
Absolutely, I'd hugely agree. It's just the sound of the rain drumming onto the car there. I hope that's not going to ruin the audio too much. We will persevere. So tell me a bit about the text we're now going to move on to, sir.
Yep, so we're going to be looking at Charles Dickens's 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol. Pretty appropriate this time of year and this dark, cold, blustery weather outside the car.
In a way, it's a Christmas podcast.
It is a Christmas podcast. And the question we're going to look at is this. So, read the extract from Stave 2 of A Christmas Carol, then answer the question that follows. In this extract, Scrooge sees Belle leave him. So, Belle is Scrooge's ex-fiancée, and this is the penultimate memory of Scrooge's encounter with the ghost of Christmas past.
Very difficult memory for him.
A very difficult memory. And the question that we're going to look at today is, starting with this extract, how does Dickens present wealth in A Christmas Carol?
Okay, so why don't you contextualise the idea of wealth in the novella a little bit?
So I think wealth is, of course, a crucial theme for us to understand because A Christmas Carol centres on Scrooge, who is a misanthropic miser.
Right, a misanthropic miser. That's a great way of describing him. What does it mean?
So a misanthrope is someone a bit like me at this time of the year who just hates everyone else. And a miser is someone who doesn't like spending their money. So to describe as a misanthropic miser encapsulates his character as a man who both doesn't like other people but also is incredibly selfish about the wealth that he's collected over the years.
So it makes complete sense that Christmas would be his least favourite time of year, a time of people coming together and sharing things.
Precisely. And I think from the very opening of the novella, we could talk about in our introduction, he seems defined by his pursuit of wealth. Scrooge is, of course, a moneylender. His job is about accumulating wealth. And it's only after a series of supernatural encounters with ghosts that he comes to realise that he doesn't actually need money to make him happy.
Sometimes it does take a series of supernatural encounters with ghosts to make you see the error of your ways. I
think it does.
Yeah.
And the ultimate message, therefore, is that the society should be less greedy, less defined by money. And like Scrooge, that Victorian society should also be defined more by kindness.
And is the message there as well that people can learn and change? Is there an optimistic feel to the novella, would you say?
I think that's crucial to the success of the novella, that actually at the heart of it has this optimistic message. It's a message about the potential in everyone to change the way they see the world.
Fantastic. Okay, so are we ready, do you think, to move into the question itself?
Yeah, definitely. So, as I said, the extract is from Stave 2. And in this extract, we see Belle leave him, and she leaves him because she thinks that he doesn't love her anymore because he loves money more than he loves her. So we can start with something about the idea that, in this extract, Dickens explores how Scrooge chooses wealth over love. A decision which, in the context of the novella as a whole, actually leaves him deeply unhappy and alone. And this is perhaps the thing that he starts to learn from the Ghost of Christmas Past.
And so the students should be honing in on this idea that we're seeing kind of the pivotal moment of his life where he literally chose material wealth over spiritual happiness that he could get from another human. What's the best language in the extract that you would use to make that point?
Yeah, it's really raining outside now, isn't it? The first one we can look at is at the start of the extract. When Scrooge looks at his younger self, he sees signs of avarice in his face. He sees signs which show the passion which had taken root and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall.
Well, that's a fantastic metaphor. How would you unpack that?
Yeah, I think, firstly, before we look at the metaphor, this draws upon a bit of context we need to understand. It draws upon the Victorian theory of physiognomy, which is the idea where someone's appearance would reflect their character.
Right, we talked about this in another podcast. We talked about the concept of Mr. Hyde. being affected by this.
Definitely. And so what we can see, the idea of the signs of avarice being in his face, it implies metaphorically that he's being defined, his appearance and perhaps his character is being defined by his greed.
What is that? What does that word mean, avarice?
So avarice just means greed.
Right.
And then the extended metaphor of the idea of this passion having taken root in him, the shadow of the growing tree, being visible now. It's a metaphor that implies that somehow his desire for wealth is this tree that's kind of it's spread down, it's growing inside him, digging deeper and deeper into his psyche until it comes to define him.
That's a really interesting metaphor, isn't it? Because students might want to draw on perhaps their slightly paradoxical nature, that a tree is often seen as hope, new life, the future, that kind of stuff, but in this case it's
the only thing growing inside him is greed.
Right, that's really interesting.
I think the second perhaps most important point in this extract is of course what Belle says. Belle says that she has been displaced by an idol, and she says, another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve.
And I suppose by using the metaphor of the idol, because what does idol typically mean? God?
Yeah, well, not quite. So I think this is a specific allusion to the Old Testament story in the Bible of the Israelites, who, as they were leaving Egypt, they melted down all of their jewellery to create a golden calf, which they worshipped instead of God. So the idea of Scrooge worshipping a golden idol implies that, like the Israelites, he's worshipping gold, he's worshipping money over perhaps the true God, and by extension, this is also something that's going to lead to his suffering, because the Israelites were punished for this by God by being exiled to the desert for 40 years. So this allusion contains in it both the idea of Scrooge worshipping money, but also the idea that this is something that will lead to his punishment.
Fantastic. So that really sets out the first paragraph, doesn't it? The analysis of Scrooge as this man who sacrificed everything for wealth, and also how it was foreshadowing that would lead to his downfall with this kind of biblical reference. Fantastic. So that takes us, I suppose, into the next paragraph, where we move on and look at other points in the play. Where are you headed?
Novella,
next?
Sir.
Sorry,
just made the mistake that our students all make.
It's incredibly early in the morning.
It's incredibly early, and it's raining and it's cold.
This is we're really suffering for this podcast. But yeah, paragraph 2. Then we are moving on into another point in the novella. Where are we going?
Yeah, I think we need to look more generally at how Dickens presents the pursuit of wealth as a negative thing. And I think the best moments to look at this actually are also from Stave 1. So Marley, looking at the depiction of Marley's ghost, and also Scrooge's encounters with various people in Stave 1 and what they show about him. So I think looking first at his encounter with Marley's ghost. Marley is, of course, Scrooge's business partner. Yeah. He's been dead, we're told at the start of the novella, for a number of years. And as a result of this encounter with Marley's ghost, Scrooge starts to change.
Right.
I think what's really important when analysing wealth in the novella is how the appearance of Marley's ghost metaphorically shows how he's been chained by his wealth and selfishness. Dickens describes how there's this heavy chain that wound around him. There's cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel in the chain.
So language from the semantic field of money and lending and business and
Precisely.
all that kind of thing.
And obviously being emblematic here of the idea that actually these very things that defined his job as a moneylender, these things that defined his pursuit of wealth, his avarice, if you will, have now come to imprison him.
To chain him down in the afterlife.
And he acknowledges this himself. He says to Scrooge, I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it.
I think that's a really interesting line. The idea of him making it so sort of slowly and meticulously kind of implies that he had lots of chances not to do it.
Precisely, I think. And also if we look at the active verbs here, forged and girded, it implies that he had agency both in the creation of these selfish deeds, and also girded implying he wrapped it around himself. The idea therefore is that the punishment that you get from being avaricious, from being greedy, the suggestion seems to be here, according to Marley, is that this punishment is something you do to yourself.
And also perhaps that it's not a single mistake, it's not like a crime of passion where you might murder someone in a blind rage. These are mistakes that they made over their lives. The greed built up and they wanted more and more and more. And we see that, don't we? No one's ever rich enough there. You hear people say, people get some money, they want more money, they get more money, they want more money. It's an accumulative thing.
Definitely. And I think the other thing we can look at here is Scrooge's selfish reaction to the two gentlemen. So two gentlemen come asking for money for charity. And Dickens' response is to ask whether there are workhouses or prisons, suggesting that those who lack wealth, those who lack money, should either be sent to a workhouse or should go to jail.
Right.
And another bit of a contextual point here, this is quite important because, of course, in Victorian society, workhouses were places where, if you didn't have enough money to support yourself, if you were too poor, you would potentially be sent. And these would involve splitting up families, incredibly hard work, and they were not pleasant places to be.
But I think wouldn't an interesting contextual point be that people like Scrooge at the beginning of the novella would see the workhouse as a good thing. You know, that's where the poor should be. That's where they deserve to be.
To work. And it's quite a disturbing notion. It shows this lack of empathy for those who have less money. He doesn't want to spend his money on those less fortunate than himself.
And you could argue that we still see that a lot today in society. Unfortunately, it's
Sadly.
a very relevant message. Probably not the arena to talk about that. But yes, certainly some interesting AO3
I
points
think
to get into.
then what we might want to contrast this with is looking at the characters of Fezziwig. So, of course, Scrooge is a wealthy man who's defined by his greed, but Fezziwig, who is Scrooge's old employer, is instead a man who's defined not by his wealth but by his kindness. So we can say that when we see him in stave 3, actually he could be seen as a counterpoint to Scrooge's worldview.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to go back slightly over what we've done so far because I don't want to have moved on too quickly in terms of the essay itself. So we've had our first paragraph, which is all about this idea of how wealth, you choosing wealth, kind of ruined Scrooge. Then we had this idea about, through Marley, that the pursuit of wealth is in general shown as a negative thing throughout the novella. So that's paragraph 1 and 2. Paragraph 3, we're then going into a contrasting idea.
Yeah, I think now we need to look for characters who function as counterpoints to Scrooge's worldview. I think definitely Fezziwig is one of these, who demonstrates the need for society to be less selfish.
It's even quite a kind sounding name, Fezziwig, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think one thing we could pick out here is a motif that runs throughout the whole novella, which is the motif of fire.
Okay.
So at the start, throughout the novella, Dickens uses the motif of fire to represent, metaphorically, the Christmas spirit, to represent kindness. And we see this particularly importantly here in the description of Fezziwig. Fezziwig is described at this party that he throws for his employees as having this huge fire that gives out a lot of warmth. Dickens describes how fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright as a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night.
So the ongoing thing is the idea that money equals coldness, right? That the more you harbour wealth and material stuff, the colder your life is. The more you seek human interaction and kindness, the more warmth in your life. Yeah.
So metaphorically, we could see how the large fire in Fezziwig's room represents his Christmas spirit, his kindness, that he's defined not by that coldness, that misanthropy that Scrooge has.
That's interesting.
We see this. So a great thing to contrast that with, therefore, would be the cold imagery of stave 1. Scrooge described as having carried his low temperature around with him. He's described as having a frosty rime upon his head, a metaphor that's implying both his white hair colour, because a frosty rime is, of course, that kind of the ice you get on the ground in mornings, but also, of course, it's again connoting his coldness. And perhaps most importantly, when describing Bob Cratchit, his employee, Dickens describes how Bob Cratchit had only a single coal at the start of the novella, and when he and he's cold, he's shivering, he's warming his hands on a candle. So the juxtaposition between Fezziwig's warm office and Scrooge's cold is clearly meant to encapsulate this difference in worldviews, one defined by the cold pursuit of wealth, one defined by human kindness. This motif is extended also further in the description of the Cratchits, who gather around a fire in their living room in stave 3, and also the other working class characters, the miners, the lighthouse keepers, the sailors, all of them at Christmas time. Dickens describes them in stave 3 gathering around a fire and singing Christmas carols.
I suppose it's a nice image in the sense that on the one hand it's about keeping warm as a kind of survival thing, but actually what it becomes about is the idea of community and togetherness and all these things that Scrooge lacks. And what students can therefore develop through paragraph 3 is this idea that what Scrooge really thinks is valuable in the world doesn't have any true value. Is that right?
Definitely. And I think before we kind of finish, I would like to get onto a bit of a stretch and challenge point here, because I think particularly when you're writing, when you're aiming for the top grades, you want to evaluate your opinion and think, actually, is it as simple as all that? So initially through this essay, we've argued quite simply that there's a very clear moral message in this novella.
Money bad,
money is bad, friendship and love is
something you might
good.
want to try and remember yourself sometimes.
Definitely. But what we might want to finish in this essay by looking at, perhaps, is first of all thinking about a bit of context, and then let's evaluate it. So the first bit of context is, of course, Dickens wrote this book in 1843. He wrote it after reading an 1843 parliamentary report called the Parliamentary Commission on the Employment of Women and Children, which showed the horrific conditions in which young children were made to work underground, or tremendously long hours in appalling conditions in factories, or as chimney sweeps.
Which is the story students might be aware of from Oliver Twist. Have they read that Dickens work?
And Dickens' desire, he wrote that he wanted to write something that would, I quote, come down with sledgehammer force and make society realise the horrors of inequality.
Right, so that was his agenda. He was writing A Christmas Carol to show society's all wrong, we're treating people terribly, the rich are only concerned with themselves and the poor are being abused and maltreated.
Precisely, but the point we might want to end on is perhaps we might want to evaluate, does he actually succeed that? Because one thing I would argue is that Dickens's message is fundamentally socially conservative, and I mean that with a small c.
Mm-hmm.
So socially conservative means that he doesn't really want society to change that much. The message ultimately is not that wealth should be redistributed to the poor, that taxes should be higher, that we should have a national health service, or anything of that nature. The message actually is quite is more humanist. He wants the wealthy to be more generous towards the poor. So we could contrast him with other writers at this time, like Friedrich Engels, who are actually talking about more revolutionary changes. Whereas Dickens's message about wealth is not that the rich should not accumulate wealth. That's not what he's arguing. He's simply arguing that for those who are wealthy, they should be slightly more generous, particularly around Christmas time.
So if we were being really cynical, we would say that Dickens's message is there still should be a poor. Like, it's okay that there's a poor, we should just all be a bit nicer to them.
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice point to put in your conclusion just here, that although it's this novella with a really positive message, although it seems to be about how the accumulation of wealth is bad, it doesn't make you happy, at no point does it suggest an alternative worldview.
A different system.
A different system. At no point does it imply, like Friedrich Engels, that we should have revolution. The message is that we should be more generous towards the poor, especially at Christmas.
What an interesting... Well, and what a key theme to end on, I would say. Thank you for joining us again. I hope the rain that's been beating down throughout this recording hasn't ruined it too much. Maybe it's sort of added a relaxing element, like when people listen to running water when they're meditating and that kind of stuff.
Maybe it's a metaphor for our cold, misanthropic nature hiding in the car in a dark car park in the morning.
It could well be that too. As I said at the start of the pod, there are now going to be, on each individual one, there is a downloadable handout which comes with the quotations we've talked about, the vocabulary we've used, and also some nice AO3 context as well as the question itself. So please download those and listen along as you are going through the handout. And I think all that's left to say is a very happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas.